You don't declare a jet dead unless you're ready to be proven wrong." The words came with a sharp laugh as Kyle Kramer's boot struck the landing gear of the silent F-18, the dull metallic thud swallowed by the wide, sun-baked tarmac. Heat shimmered in wavering lines above the concrete, distorting the horizon like a mirage, while the aircraft sat motionless, its grey body reflecting the harsh midday light, engines cold, lifeless, and stubbornly quiet. Around it, a dozen technicians stood in tight formation, arms crossed, tablets glowing with diagnostic screens that all told the same story in bright green text, every system functional, every circuit intact, every sensor reporting perfection, and yet the jet refused to respond, a machine that should have roared now reduced to nothing more than a silent monument. 6 hours, Kramer muttered, wiping grease from his hands onto a rag, his voice edged with frustration and pride, unwilling to admit defeat. 6 hours and this thing won't even cough. Lieutenant Brooks paced nearby, jaw tight, glancing repeatedly at his watch as if time itself might bend under pressure, because in less than 30 minutes, General Whitaker was scheduled to arrive for a demonstration flight that now hung in uncertainty, and failure was not an option anyone here could afford. The air carried a low hum of tension, broken only by the faint clatter of tools and the distant whine of another aircraft lifting off somewhere beyond the runway, a reminder of what this machine should have been doing. Standing just outside the circle of activity was a man no one had invited, his presence quiet, almost invisible against the noise of authority and urgency. Eli Vance, his faded olive jacket hanging loose on his thin frame, hands resting casually in his pockets as if he had nowhere else to be, his pale blue eyes fixed not on the technicians, not on the screens, but on the jet itself, studying it with a stillness that felt out of place in a world driven by speed and data. Brooks noticed him first, a flicker of irritation crossing his face as he stepped over, posture rigid with command. "Sir, this is a restricted area," he said, the word "sir" carrying none of its usual respect, only procedure. Eli didn't answer right away, his gaze lingering on the aircraft, tracing lines invisible to everyone else, as though the machine was speaking in a language only he remembered. Kramer followed Brooks's glance and let out a short, amused breath. "You here for the show, old man?" he called out, loud enough for the others to hear, drawing a few quiet chuckles from the team. "Because you picked a bad day. This bird's done." The laughter lingered in the heat, light but cutting, the kind that came easy when confidence hadn't yet been tested. Eli finally shifted his eyes, meeting Kramer's for a brief moment, calm and unreadable, before returning his attention to the jet, as if the conversation had already passed him by. The silence that followed was subtle, almost unnoticed, but it lingered just long enough to feel different, like the air itself had changed, and somewhere beneath the hum of equipment and the ticking clock, something else was beginning to surface, something no diagnostic screen could measure, something the jet had been waiting for all along. The ticking of Lieutenant Brooks's watch seemed louder now, each second cutting through the heavy air like a quiet warning that time was running out whether they were ready or not, and still the jet sat there, unmoved, unresponsive, its silence beginning to feel almost deliberate. Kramer exhaled sharply and turned back to his team, clapping his hands once as if he could force momentum back into the situation. "Run the diagnostics again," he said, though the edge in his voice betrayed that he already knew the outcome, and within seconds the same glowing lines filled the screens, green across the board, flawless systems reporting a machine that should have been airborne. "See that?" Kramer said, gesturing toward the nearest tablet, his tone louder now, directed not just at his team but toward the quiet figure still standing a few yards away. "This is what real data looks like. Not guesswork." A few technicians nodded, reassured by numbers they trusted, even as the contradiction sat right in front of them, a jet that refused to obey its own perfection. Eli did not move. His eyes followed the faint outline of the fuselage, the seams between panels, the subtle way the sunlight caught along the edge of the intake, and for a brief moment, he tilted his head just slightly, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Brooks noticed it, a flicker of uncertainty passing through his otherwise controlled posture. "Sir," he said again, more firmly this time, stepping closer, "if you are not assigned here, I am going to have to ask you to leave." Eli's gaze shifted slowly from the aircraft to the officer, steady and unhurried, and when he spoke, his voice was low, rough with age but carrying a weight that did not match his appearance. "She is not dead," he said. The words hung in the air, simple and quiet, yet somehow cutting through the noise of machinery and authority alike. Kramer let out a short laugh, shaking his head as he turned away. "We have a dozen certified specialists and 6 hours of diagnostics that say otherwise," he replied, his tone sharpening, "but sure, you just walked in and figured it out." The team chuckled again, the sound brittle this time, as if they needed it to hold their confidence together. Eli did not react to the laughter. Instead, he took a single step forward, closing the distance to the aircraft just enough to reach out, his hand hovering for a moment before resting lightly against the metal skin near the forward panel. The contact was gentle, almost respectful, his fingers pressing just enough to feel the structure beneath, and for a brief second, the world around him seemed to dim, the bright glare of the tarmac fading into something older, something carried in memory rather than sight. The faint echo of a distant engine, not heard but remembered, passed through his expression, and his eyes narrowed slightly as if aligning two moments separated by decades. Behind him, Kramer scoffed, crossing his arms. "What are you doing, listening to it?" he said, the sarcasm sharp and open now. "This is not some old prop job. It does not have feelings." Eli's hand remained where it was, unmoved by the comment, his focus fixed on a specific section of the fuselage just below the intake, where a panel sat flush enough to pass inspection, perfect enough to satisfy every sensor, and yet something about it was not right. Brooks followed his gaze, then looked back at the diagnostic readouts, then back again, the tension in his jaw tightening as the countdown continued, and somewhere in the distance, the low rumble of an approaching convoy began to rise, a subtle reminder that the general was already on his way, and whatever happened next would not stay unnoticed. The rumble of the approaching convoy grew louder, a low rolling vibration that seemed to travel through the concrete before it ever reached the ears, and every technician on the line felt it, whether they admitted it or not, because it meant the window was closing and whatever solution they had hoped for was no longer theoretical. Lieutenant Brooks turned toward the sound instinctively, then back to the jet, then finally to Eli, his patience thinning under the weight of expectation. "We do not have time for this," he said, his voice tight, controlled but strained. "If you have something to say, say it." Eli did not look at him right away. His fingers traced the edge of the panel slowly, not touching it now, just hovering a fraction of an inch above the surface, following a line that no one else seemed to notice. The sunlight hit the metal at an angle, revealing a faint shadow where the panel met the fuselage, a line so subtle it disappeared the moment you looked directly at it. "It is off," Eli said quietly. Kramer let out an audible sigh, shaking his head as he stepped forward, clearly done entertaining what he saw as nonsense. "That panel was torque-checked twice," he replied, tapping on his tablet as if the data itself would settle the argument. "Every measurement is within tolerance. Perfect alignment." Eli finally looked at him, not confrontational, not defensive, just certain. "Not for this one." The words landed heavier than expected, and for a moment, no one spoke. Then Kramer stepped closer, placing his hand firmly against the panel, pressing along its edge. "Feels fine to me," he said, louder now, inviting agreement from the others. A few technicians nodded, one even stepping in to run his fingers along the same seam, confirming what the instruments had already told them. "Perfect." Brooks exhaled slowly, glancing once more toward the distant convoy now clearly visible beyond the far end of the runway, black vehicles moving with purpose, and then back to Eli. "We are not opening a sealed panel based on a feeling," he said, his tone final, anchored in protocol. Eli did not argue. He simply stepped back half a pace, his hand lowering to his side, his gaze still fixed on that same narrow line of metal as if the answer had not changed just because it had been. "Denied." The silence that followed stretched longer this time, uncomfortable, pressing in around the group as the hum of the bass continued in the background, indifferent to the tension building here. It was Airman Cole who broke first. He had been standing near the edge of the group, quiet until now, his eyes moving between the panel, the diagnostics, and the old man, something unsettled forming in his expression. He had seen experienced technicians miss things before, small details buried under layers of assumption, and there was something about the way Eli had not hesitated, had not needed to check a screen or confirm a reading, that did not sit right with him. "Sir," Cole said carefully, addressing Brooks but not taking his eyes off the panel, "what if we just check it?" Kramer turned on him immediately. "Check what?" he snapped. "A ghost problem? We do not break factory seals because someone thinks the jet feels wrong." Cole hesitated, but only for a second. "It would take 2 minutes," he said, quieter now, but steady. Brooks looked between them, the pressure mounting in real time, the convoy now less than a mile out, the decision narrowing into something unavoidable, and for the first time since this started, uncertainty crossed his face, not because of the machine, but because of the man standing silently beside it, as if he already knew what everyone else was about to learn. The convoy was close enough now that the sunlight caught flashes of polished black metal between the buildings, the distant growl of engines rolling steadily across the base like an approaching storm, and Lieutenant Brooks felt it in his chest more than he heard it, a pressure that demanded a decision he was not ready to make. His eyes moved from Airman Cole to Kramer, then finally to Eli, who stood exactly where he had been, unchanged, as if time had slowed around him while everything else accelerated. Brooks exhaled through his nose, the tension visible now, no longer hidden behind protocol. 2 minutes, he said at last, the words reluctant but firm. Kramer stared at him in disbelief. "Sir, that panel is sealed. Breaking it triggers a full maintenance report, paperwork, inspection review. There is nothing behind it that is not already accounted for." Brooks did not look at him. 2 minutes, he repeated. The authority in his voice settled it. Kramer's jaw tightened, but he turned, signaling to one of the technicians for tools, his movements sharp, controlled, the kind that came from someone forcing himself to comply with a decision he did not agree with. The small toolkit snapped open with a metallic click, the sound crisp against the growing noise of the approaching vehicles, and for a brief moment, all conversation faded as the team gathered closer, drawn in by something they did not fully understand. Eli did not step forward. He did not reach for the tools or offer instructions. He simply watched, his eyes fixed on the panel, waiting. Kramer positioned the driver against the fasteners, pausing just long enough to glance back at Brooks, as if offering one last chance to stop this, but Brooks gave no signal, his focus locked on the task now unfolding. The first bolt turned with a tight, controlled resistance, a short metallic creak that carried farther than it should have, followed by another, and then another, each one loosening a piece of certainty the team had been holding onto. As the final fastener came free, Kramer pulled the panel slightly outward, just enough to break the seal, and a faint shift in the sound of the air followed, subtle but real, like a sealed space finally allowed to breathe. He hesitated for half a second, then opened it fully. What lay behind it was not dramatic, not broken in any obvious way, no sparks, no visible failure, just a compact arrangement of components sitting exactly where they should have been, clean, organized, and to anyone relying on systems and readings alone, perfectly functional. Kramer exhaled, almost relieved, and looked back over his shoulder with a faint, vindicated smirk beginning to form. "There is nothing here," he started to say. "Look closer," Eli said, his voice cutting through the moment before it could settle. It was not loud, but it carried, and something in the way he said it made Kramer pause instead of dismiss it outright. Kramer turned back, leaning in slightly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the assembly again, this time slower, more deliberate, and for a second, nothing changed. Then his expression shifted, just barely. A line, thinner than a hair, sat just off-center where two components met, not misaligned enough to trigger a sensor, not enough to fail a tolerance check, but enough to matter. "It is off," Kramer said quietly, the certainty gone from his voice. Eli nodded once, almost imperceptibly. 2 millimeters, he said. The number hung there, small and precise, and suddenly every green checkmark on every screen felt incomplete. Brooks stepped closer, his posture tightening again, but this time not from pressure, from realization, as the convoy finally reached the edge of the tarmac and the lead vehicle slowed, the moment of truth arriving exactly when no one was ready for it. For a moment, no one spoke, the discovery settling over the group like a weight that pressed down harder than the approaching convoy ever could, and Kramer remained frozen in place, his hand still resting near the open panel, his eyes locked on that barely visible misalignment that had slipped past every system they trusted. The confidence that had filled his voice minutes ago was gone, replaced by something quieter, something uncertain, and he leaned in closer, inspecting it again as if the angle might change the truth. "That is within tolerance," he said, but the words lacked conviction now, more habit than belief. Eli stepped forward for the first time since the panel had been opened, not rushed, not dramatic, just a single measured step that shifted the balance of the moment. "Not for ignition sequencing," he replied, his voice steady, almost matter of fact. Brooks turned sharply toward him. "Explain," he said, the urgency no longer hidden. Eli glanced briefly at the exposed components, then back at Brooks. "It is not enough to fail a test," he said. "But it is enough to confuse timing." Kramer frowned, the explanation cutting against everything he had been trained to rely on. "The system compensates for variance," he argued, though now he was speaking more to understand than to challenge. Eli shook his head slightly. "The system compensates for what it expects," he said. "This, it does not expect." The word settled into the silence, and for the first time, the machine did not feel unpredictable, it felt misunderstood. Behind them, the lead vehicle of the convoy rolled to a slow stop at the edge of the tarmac, its engine idling with a low, controlled rumble, a presence that did not need to announce itself to be felt. Airman Cole glanced over his shoulder at it, then back to Eli, his unease now turning into something else, something closer to recognition. Kramer straightened, running a hand over his jaw as he processed what he was seeing. "So what?" he said, "quieter now, we realign it and that is it." Eli did not answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, worn tool, the metal dulled with age, edges softened from years of use, something that did not belong among the precision instruments scattered across the workstation nearby. He held it for a second, as if measuring the moment, then extended his hand toward the open panel. Kramer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, before stepping aside. No one told him to. He simply did. Eli leaned in, his movement slow and exact, the kind of control that did not come from manuals or procedures but from memory, his fingers adjusting the alignment with a precision that seemed almost too small to matter, a subtle shift, a correction so slight it would have been invisible to anyone not looking for it. The metal gave a faint, almost inaudible click, a sound so soft it could have been imagined, but every head around the aircraft lifted at once, drawn to it as if something deeper had just fallen into place. Eli withdrew his hand, studying the panel for a brief second longer, then nodded once. "Close it," he said. Kramer did not argue this time. He moved quickly, securing the panel back into place, tightening each fastener with renewed focus, no longer rushing, no longer dismissive, the earlier arrogance replaced by a quiet urgency that matched the moment. Brooks stepped back, his eyes shifting between the jet and the convoy, the space between decision and consequence now razor-thin. "Start sequence," he ordered. The command hung in the air for a split second before the nearest technician moved, fingers flying across the controls, initiating the process they had run dozens of times already with no result. The jet remained still at first, silent, unchanged, and for a heartbeat, doubt crept back in, fragile but real, until a faint sound broke through, low and uneven, like something waking from a long, reluctant sleep, and every person on that tarmac felt it at the exact same moment. The sound started as a tremor more than a noise, a faint uneven vibration that traveled through the metal skin of the jet before it ever reached the air, and every technician froze in place, eyes snapping toward the engine as if they had all been waiting for permission to believe it. The ignition sequence continued, slow and deliberate, and the quiet cough deepened into a low rolling hum, unstable at first, then steadier, like a rhythm finding itself after being lost for far too long. Kramer did not move, his hand still resting on the edge of the panel he had just sealed, his eyes wide, locked on the intake as the airflow shifted, subtle at first, then unmistakable. "No way," he whispered under his breath, the words barely audible even to himself. The hum grew stronger, building layer by layer, the internal systems aligning in real time, responding to something they had refused to recognize just minutes ago, and the jet that had sat lifeless under the sun now carried a presence that filled the entire tarmac. Brooks stepped forward instinctively, his posture tightening as the engine spooled higher, the sound now clean, controlled, no longer struggling but confident, as if the machine had simply been waiting for the right moment to respond. The technicians exchanged quick glances, disbelief written across every face, their screen still glowing green but now finally matching the reality in front of them. Airman Cole felt it in his chest, the vibration steady and strong, and for a brief second, he looked at Eli instead of the jet, as if trying to understand how a man who had not touched a single diagnostic tool had seen what none of them could. Eli stood exactly where he had been, hands relaxed at his sides, his expression unchanged, watching the aircraft not with surprise, but with quiet confirmation, as if the outcome had never been in doubt. The engine reached full idle, the sound now smooth and even, a deep controlled roar that echoed across the runway, and the heat shimmer intensified behind the exhaust, bending the air in waves that blurred the far edge of the base. The convoy had fully stopped now, doors opening in measured sequence, but no one stepped forward immediately, because every eye had been drawn to the same thing, the jet that had just come back to life against every expectation. Kramer finally stepped back, a slow movement as if his body was catching up to what his mind had not yet processed, and he looked at Eli again, really looked this time, not at the jacket or the age or the silence, but at the certainty that had been there from the start. "You knew," he said, not as a challenge, not even as a question, but as a realization. Eli did not answer. He did not need to. The sound of the engine filled the space between them, steady and undeniable, and in that moment, the balance had shifted completely, not with force, not with argument, but with a single correction that no system had been able to see. Brooks turned toward the convoy, his expression sharpening as figures began to emerge, uniforms crisp, movements precise, and he straightened instinctively, the weight of command returning, but now layered with something else, something closer to respect. Behind him, the technician stood in silence, no longer speaking, no longer laughing, the earlier noise replaced by a stillness that carried far more weight, because they all understood, at the exact same moment, that what they had witnessed was not luck, and it was not guesswork, it was something older, something earned, something they had not been trained to measure. The engine's steady roar settled into a deep, controlled rhythm that filled the airfield, no longer fighting itself, no longer searching for balance, and every person standing there could feel the difference in their bones, a machine that had gone from silence to certainty in a matter of seconds. The doors of the lead vehicle opened with quiet precision, and a pair of officers stepped out first, scanning the scene with trained awareness before one of them turned slightly, giving a subtle nod toward the back seat. The rear door opened, and General Whitaker stepped out, his uniform immaculate, his presence immediate, the kind that did not need introduction or announcement to command attention. Conversations died instantly, technicians straightened, Brooks snapped to full posture, and even Kramer instinctively stepped back from the aircraft as if making space for something larger than himself. The general's eyes moved once across the jet, taking in the heat distortion, the steady engine tone, the subtle vibration in the air, and for a brief second, something shifted in his expression, not surprise, not confusion, but recognition. He began walking toward the aircraft with measured steps, his gaze focused, passing Brooks without a word, ignoring the cluster of technicians entirely, as if the explanation he had been expecting was already standing somewhere ahead. Brooks opened his mouth slightly, ready to report, but the words never came, because the general did not slow, did not acknowledge him, his attention fixed on a single figure standing just off the nose of the jet. Eli had not moved. He stood where he had been from the beginning, the same worn jacket, the same quiet posture, the same stillness that had once looked out of place and now felt like the center of everything. The distance between them closed, step by step, until the general stopped just a few feet away, the engine noise rolling behind them like a constant reminder of what had just happened. For a moment, neither man spoke. The technicians watched, unsure, the tension shifting into something unfamiliar, something heavier than pressure, something closer to realization. Kramer glanced at Brooks, then back at the general, trying to understand why the highest-ranking officer on the field had bypassed every report, every explanation, and come straight here. Airman Cole felt it before anyone said it, the sense that this moment was not about the jet anymore, that the machine had only been the doorway to something else entirely. The general's posture changed slightly, not relaxed, but adjusted, his shoulders lowering just enough to remove the edge of command, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried clearly even against the steady engine behind them. "You always did know how to listen to them," he said. The words landed quietly, but they rippled through the group, confusion spreading across the technicians who had expected questions, not familiarity. Eli met his gaze, calm as ever, and gave the smallest nod, an acknowledgement that needed no explanation. The general's eyes held on him for another second, then he stepped back half a pace, his hand rising in a motion that was precise, deliberate, and unmistakable. The salute came sharp and clean, held without hesitation, and for a fraction of a second, the entire airfield seemed to pause, every sound, every movement, every thought suspended in that single gesture. No one spoke. No one moved. Because in that moment, the truth had already been revealed without a single story being told. The salute remained in the air for a heartbeat longer than anyone expected, held with a precision that carried more meaning than any explanation could have, and then, slowly, Eli returned it, not with the sharp edge of ceremony, but with a calm, practiced motion that felt older, quieter, and somehow heavier, as if it had been carried across decades rather than drilled on a parade ground. Around them, the technician stood frozen, the earlier noise of tools and chatter replaced by a silence that pressed in from all sides, broken only by the steady, confident hum of the engine behind them. Kramer felt it most of all, the shift that had taken place without warning, his mind racing back through every word he had said, every laugh, every dismissive glance, and none of it fit anymore, not with what he was seeing now. The general lowered his hand and took a step closer, his voice quieter this time, but no less clear. "They told me you were out," he said. Eli gave a faint shrug, almost imperceptible. "I was," he replied. The simplicity of the exchange carried more weight than any formal introduction could have, and Brooks stood just a few feet away, unsure whether to step forward or remain exactly where he was, his training pulling him in one direction while the moment held him in place. The general turned slightly, just enough to acknowledge the rest of the team without fully shifting his focus. "Who opened the panel?" he asked. There was a brief hesitation before Kramer spoke, his voice lower than before, stripped of its earlier edge. "I did, sir." The general nodded once, not approving, not disapproving, simply noting it, then looked back at Eli. "He always was good at spotting what the rest of us missed," he said, the statement directed outward but anchored firmly in the man standing in front of him. A ripple of quiet recognition passed through the group, not full understanding, not yet, but enough to change the way they stood, the way they looked at Eli, the way they understood what had just happened. Airman Cole shifted his weight slightly, his earlier uncertainty now replaced with something steadier, something closer to respect, as if a missing piece had finally clicked into place. The engine continued its steady rhythm, no longer the center of attention, but a constant reminder of the moment that had brought them here. Kramer took a slow step back, giving Eli more space without being told, his earlier confidence replaced by a careful awareness, and he glanced once at the panel, then back at the man who had corrected it with a movement so small it should not have mattered, yet had changed everything. Brooks finally found his voice. "Sir, we were running full diagnostics," he began, but the general raised a hand slightly, stopping him without looking away from Eli. "I know exactly what you were running," he said, his tone calm, not dismissive, but final. The statement hung there, not as criticism, but as a boundary between what could be measured and what had just been proven. Eli turned his gaze briefly toward the jet, watching it idle smoothly, then back to the general, his expression unchanged. "She just needed to be heard," he said. The words were simple, but they settled over the group with a clarity that no manual could provide, and for the first time, no one laughed, no one questioned, no one argued, because the truth of it was already standing in front of them, alive and impossible to ignore. The engine continued its steady, confident hum, no longer demanding attention but holding it effortlessly, like a presence that did not need to prove itself anymore, and the airfield slowly began to breathe again as movement returned in careful, measured steps. Technicians shifted their weight, some glancing back at their screens as if expecting them to explain what had just happened, others simply watching Eli with a quiet focus that had replaced every trace of earlier doubt. General Whitaker turned slightly, his gaze sweeping across the team, taking in their posture, their silence, the absence of noise that had once filled the space, and he gave a small nod, not to acknowledge success, but to mark the moment as understood. "Secure the aircraft for taxi," he said, his voice calm, controlled, and instantly the technicians moved, but differently now, not rushed, not loud, each action deliberate, as if the way they handled the machine had changed along with their understanding of it. Kramer hesitated for a second longer than the rest, then stepped forward toward Eli, stopping just short of speaking, his eyes searching for something he could not quite put into words. He began, then stopped, the sentence never forming, because nothing he could say would match the weight of what had already been shown. Eli looked at him briefly, not dismissive, not critical, just steady, and gave the slightest nod, a gesture that carried neither approval nor judgment, only acknowledgement. It was enough. Kramer exhaled quietly and stepped back, the lesson already settled deeper than any explanation could reach. Brooks approached next, his posture still formal, but the edge of authority softened by something more grounded. "Sir," he said to the general, "we were not able to identify the issue through standard procedures." The general glanced at him, then back at Eli. "Standard procedures do not account for everything," he replied, his tone even, not corrective, but absolute. The statement hung there, not as a criticism, but as a boundary drawn clearly between knowledge and experience. Airman Cole stood at the edge of the group, watching Eli one last time, the image fixing itself in his memory, not as a technician, not as a visitor, but as something else entirely, something he knew he would not forget. The jet began its slow taxi, wheels rolling forward with a smooth, controlled motion, the engine sound shifting slightly as it moved, no longer a test, no longer a question, but a certainty that carried itself down the runway. Eli turned his head just enough to follow it for a moment, the faintest hint of reflection passing through his eyes, as if he were seeing more than just the aircraft in front of him. Then he looked away, the moment already behind him. The general watched him for a second longer, then gave a final nod, a quiet recognition that did not need witnesses, and turned back toward the convoy. The team remained where they were, no one speaking, no one needing to, because the lesson had already settled into the space between them, carried in the silence that followed. And as the jet disappeared into the distance, its sound fading into the open sky, what remained was not the memory of a machine brought back to life, but the understanding that some knowledge is not written in manuals, not stored in systems, but carried quietly by those who have lived it, waiting for the moment when it is needed most.